In a world torn apart by war, few stories are as extraordinary as that of Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the woman who would come to be known as Lady Death. Born in 1916 in Kiev, then part of the Soviet Union, she was a child of intelligence, curiosity, and uncommon courage. From a very early age, Lyudmila displayed a remarkable aptitude for precision and focus. While other children were content to play in the streets or follow ordinary routines, she spent her time in the forests surrounding her home, learning the art of hunting and the discipline required to handle a rifle with skill beyond her years. Her family soon realized that she was no ordinary child. She possessed a patience and calmness that seemed almost unnatural for someone so young, traits that would serve her later in ways no one could have imagined. By the time she was a teenager, Lyudmila had already mastered the use of firearms. She knew how to track her prey silently, how to take aim with meticulous care, and how to remain unseen while observing her target. Each movement was deliberate, each breath calculated. Her love for the woods, the thrill of the hunt, and her desire for perfection began to mold a young girl into someone who would one day strike fear into the hearts of experienced soldiers. Those early years of solitude, learning, and practice were laying the foundation for what would become a legendary military career. Beyond her extraordinary skill with firearms, Lyudmila was also deeply committed to her education. She was a student of history at Kyiv University, where she displayed not only intelligence, but also a remarkable ability to analyze and observe. She understood patterns, she noticed details others overlooked, and she absorbed knowledge with an intensity that set her apart. It was this combination of intellect and precision, this rare blending of mind and skill, that made her a formidable force long before she ever faced an enemy on the battlefield. Everything changed in June of 1941. The German army launched a massive invasion of the Soviet Union, a campaign that would come to be known as Operation Barbarossa. Cities fell, families fled, and the Red Army struggled to defend its territory against the onslaught. Lyudmila watched as the world she knew was upended, and she felt a calling that she could not ignore. The safety of her home, the lives of her fellow citizens, and the fate of her nation weighed heavily on her heart. She understood that she could not simply continue her studies or live a life of relative security while her country was under attack. Driven by a sense of duty, courage, and determination, Lyudmila made the decision to volunteer for the Red Army. She left behind her education, her home, and the ordinary life she had known, stepping into a world defined by danger, violence, and uncertainty. It was a choice that would forever change her life, transforming her from a young student with extraordinary skills into one of history's deadliest snipers. Even in her earliest days within the military, her talents were apparent. Her focus, patience, and remarkable accuracy quickly set her apart from other recruits. She was not just a soldier. She was someone who could observe, calculate, and strike with unparalleled precision. Her instructors took note, and her peers began to recognize that there was something extraordinary about her, something that would eventually earn her the nickname Lady Death, a name whispered with fear and respect both on the battlefield and far beyond it.
Lyudmila Pavlichenko's story is not merely one of numbers or kills. It is the story of a young woman who combined talent, intellect, and determination to become a symbol of resistance and fearlessness. It is the story of someone who faced unimaginable odds, survived where many did not, and emerged as a living legend. This is the story of Lady Death, a sniper whose name would echo through history, whose presence on the battlefield was a turning point, and whose life, though partially forgotten by the world, remains an inspiring testament to courage, skill, and relentless dedication. The years leading up to her first deployment were filled with preparation, training, and anticipation. She learned not only to shoot, but to observe, to move silently, to calculate angles, wind, and distance with precision that would later save her life countless times. Each day brought her closer to the moment when her talents would be tested under fire, and each lesson, each careful practice, reinforced the extraordinary combination of patience and deadly skill that would define her career. It was in these formative years, between the quiet of forests and the halls of learning, that the foundation of her legend was built. A legend that would terrify enemies, inspire allies, and endure in history long after the war had ended. And yet, at this moment, she was still just a young woman preparing to face the unimaginable.
When Lyudmila Pavlichenko finally received her orders to report for duty, the world around her was already burning. The German forces were advancing deep into Soviet territory, and the front lines were chaotic. As she stepped onto the battlefield for the first time, she carried not only her rifle, but also the weight of countless lives depending on her skill. The air smelled of gunpowder and blood. The ground trembled with explosions, and the cries of the wounded echoed across the ruined cities. This was no training ground anymore. This was war, raw, merciless, and real. Her first assignment came near the port city of Odessa, a crucial defense point under heavy German attack. She was part of a sniper unit sent to eliminate enemy scouts and officers attempting to breach the Soviet defenses. The first few days were a test of endurance and nerves. She would lie for hours in the dirt, unmoving, watching through her scope, waiting for the perfect moment. The sun burned during the day, the cold bit her skin at night, and hunger became an unwanted companion. Yet she never complained. She knew that patience was her greatest weapon. And then the moment came. Her first confirmed kill. A German soldier emerged cautiously from the rubble, scanning the area for danger. Lyudmila exhaled slowly, her finger tightening on the trigger. One shot echoed through the ruins. Precise, clean, final. The man fell instantly. She didn't celebrate. She didn't even smile. She just noted it in her logbook. One down. It was not pride she felt, but a strange silence, a cold acceptance of what her life had now become. From that day onward, she was no longer a student or a civilian. She was a sniper, a weapon of precision. Her performance in Odessa stunned her commanders. Within a few weeks, her confirmed kills rose from 1 to dozens. She moved like a ghost between ruined buildings, striking unseen, vanishing before anyone could respond. The enemy began to fear her presence. German soldiers started whispering about the unseen Soviet woman who could eliminate an entire squad before disappearing into the smoke. By the end of the Odessa campaign, Lyudmila had already killed over 100 enemy soldiers. Her name started spreading beyond her unit, beyond the city, across the front lines and into the enemy's ranks. German radio transmissions began referring to her as the Invisible Death. Soviet officers, amazed by her calmness and efficiency, started to see her not just as a soldier, but as a symbol. When the Soviet forces were forced to retreat from Odessa and regroup at Sevastopol, Lyudmila went with them. The siege of Sevastopol would become one of the bloodiest and most brutal battles of the Eastern Front, and it was here that her legend truly began. The terrain was rough, the weather unforgiving, and the enemy relentless. For months, Lyudmila held her position, often surviving on minimal food and water. Yet even in these conditions, her kill count continued to rise. She began to track enemy snipers, a deadly game where one mistake meant death. The duels were silent. Invisible battles fought through scopes and shadows. One by one she eliminated them, trained professionals who had hunted others for years but could not outsmart her. One encounter stood out. A German sniper who had already killed several Soviet officers was hunting her. For 3 days they stalked each other through the ruins. She watched his patterns, studied his movements, and waited. On the 3rd day, just as the sun began to rise, she spotted a faint reflection, the glint of his scope. In that instant, she fired. Silence followed. Another ghost defeated. Another victory written in the dirt. By mid-1942, her official kill count had reached 309 confirmed kills, including 36 enemy snipers. Each shot was a calculation, each mission a test of survival. She became a symbol of Soviet resilience, proof that fear could be overcome with focus, and that precision could turn the tide. But even heroes bleed. One day, during an intense bombardment, Lyudmila was severely injured by a mortar shell. She was pulled from the front lines, barely conscious, her rifle still clutched in her hands. The doctors told her she would not return to battle. Her comrades wept. The living legend of Sevastopol was leaving the field, yet her spirit remained unbroken. When she recovered, she was not sent back to the battlefield. Instead, she was chosen for a new mission, one that would take her far from the front lines but still serve her country. The Soviet government decided to send her to the United States as part of a diplomatic mission to gain support for the war effort. For the first time, Lady Death, The invisible sniper what would stand before the world, not hidden in the shadows, but under the spotlight. When she arrived in America, the press couldn't believe her story. A young woman, barely in her 20s, with over 300 confirmed kills. It sounded impossible. But when they met her, they saw the calm confidence in her eyes, the quiet strength of someone who had seen death and survived it. She spoke not with arrogance, but with conviction, reminding everyone that courage knows no gender and that the cost of freedom is always paid in blood and endurance. During her visit, she famously said, "Gentlemen, I am 25 years old, and I have killed 309 fascist invaders. Don't you think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long?" The world was stunned. The crowd fell silent. In that moment, Lyudmila Pavlichenko wasn't just a sniper. She was the voice of millions who fought and died for their homeland. Her story would continue to inspire soldiers, historians, and women across generations. But even as she returned home after the war, her life was forever changed. She had seen too much, lost too many, and carried memories that no medal could ever erase. Yet the name Lady Death remained eternal. The woman who once hunted in silence had become a legend that would never fade. Her story wasn't about death. It was about survival, precision, and the unbreakable strength of the human spirit. The war was still raging, but for Lyudmila Pavlichenko, something inside had already changed. The battlefield was no longer just a place of survival. It had become her world. She knew the sound of bullets better than the sound of music, and the smell of gunpowder had replaced the scent of flowers. The once curious history student from Kiev had become something else entirely. A legend, a weapon, a name whispered with fear. In Sevastopol, where the sea met the blood-soaked soil, the fighting was endless. German artillery thundered day and night, and the sky was never truly dark. The glow of explosions painted the night like a cruel reminder that peace was only a dream. Yet even in this chaos, Lyudmila found a strange rhythm, a sniper's silence in the middle of madness. Her eyes could catch movements faster than anyone in her unit. Her trigger finger never trembled. She would wait for hours, hidden in the ruins, her rifle resting on broken stone, her breath steady. To her, every enemy was a calculation, every shot a decision between life and death. But the strange thing was, with every kill, she felt less like herself. She was turning into something colder, something mechanical, the line between human and weapon fading with each trigger pull. Her comrades started calling her not just Lady Death, but the shadow of Sevastopol. They said she could appear from nowhere and vanish into thin air. Some soldiers even believed she was protected by fate, that no bullet could touch her. But Lyudmila knew better. She had seen what happened when fate changed its mind. She had buried too many friends to believe in protection. There were days when she didn't even count anymore. The official record said 309 confirmed kills, but in truth, no one really knew the real number. Some missions never got reported. Some bodies were lost to the rubble, and some she wished she could forget. One cold morning, as the fog rolled in from the Black Sea, Lyudmila found herself alone behind enemy lines. Her partner, a young soldier barely older than 20, had been hit by shrapnel. She tried to drag him to safety, but he was already gone. For a moment, the woman inside her broke through the sniper. Tears burned her eyes, but she couldn't afford to cry. Not there. Not in the middle of hell. She picked up her rifle again and disappeared into the mist. The Germans were now obsessed with her. They broadcast radio messages offering her rewards if she would defect. They even sent special snipers trained only to hunt her down, but none succeeded. She studied their habits, learned their patterns, and took them out one by one. Every enemy sniper who tried to find her ended up buried beneath the same earth they thought they controlled. But victory came at a price. Every mission, every bullet took something away from her, her sleep, her peace, her sense of who she was. At night, when the gunfire stopped and silence filled the air, she could still hear the echoes of those she had killed. Sometimes she whispered to herself, not prayers, but numbers. Numbers of the fallen. Her commanders praised her as a hero. The newspapers called her a symbol of Soviet courage. But deep down, Lyudmila knew she was losing herself. Her heart had become quiet, her eyes hollow, her smile faint. The weight of 309 souls was too heavy even for a legend. And yet, she couldn't stop. Because war has a way of changing what normal means. Killing had become her duty, her identity, her only purpose. She no longer dreamed of going home. She only dreamed of finishing what she started. But something new was about to begin. Something beyond the front lines. A shift in her fate that would take her far away from the ruins of Sevastopol. A journey that would place her under the eyes of the world and expose a side of her story no one had ever seen. As the bombs fell once more on the city she swore to protect, a message arrived, orders from Moscow. She was to report immediately. No XP. The train moved through the frozen plains of Russia, its wheels groaning against the cold steel tracks. Inside one of the compartments sat Lyudmila Pavlichenko. Silent, distant, her uniform covered with dust and faint traces of dried blood. Outside, the snow fell endlessly, burying the ruins of the war behind her. For the first time in years, she was leaving the front lines, but not because the war was over. Because someone, somewhere, had ordered her to. No one told her why she was being summoned, only that her presence was required in Moscow immediately. That word, required, echoed in her mind again and again. She had followed every order, completed every mission, faced death hundreds of times, and now they wanted her. For something else. Something that didn't feel like the battlefield. When the train finally reached Moscow, she stepped onto the platform to find soldiers waiting for her. Not comrades, but guards. Silent, cold-faced, official. They didn't salute her. They simply escorted her to a black car waiting nearby. The streets of Moscow were far away from the horror of Sevastopol. Clean, calm, almost peaceful. But to Lyudmila, that peace felt unnatural. After so many years of gunfire and screams, silence had become the strangest sound of all. The car drove through the wide avenues of the city and finally stopped outside a tall government building. As she entered, the smell of polished wood and old paper filled the air. Generals, officials, and party leaders were already seated inside a conference room. At the center of the table sat a man with cold eyes, a man she recognized immediately. "Comrade Pavlichenko," he said, his voice steady, controlled. "Your reputation precedes you. You are a hero of the Soviet Union. The people know your name. The world knows your name. But now, we need something more from you." Lyudmila stood silently. The man continued. "The Americans are watching this war. They question our strength, our resolve. We need to show them the truth, through you. You will travel to the United States, meet their leaders, speak to their people. You will tell them what you've seen. You will show them what the Soviet spirit truly means." For a moment, she didn't respond. She was trained to fight, not to speak. Her voice had always been a whisper behind a rifle, not a speech before crowds. The thought of leaving the battlefield, her only world, made her uneasy, but orders were orders. "When do I leave?" she finally asked. The man smiled faintly. "Tomorrow." That night, she didn't sleep. She sat by the window of her temporary quarters, staring at the city lights. The glow reminded her of explosions. Every flicker, every shadow outside the glass, felt like a memory of something she had survived but couldn't escape. She thought of the friends she'd buried, of the soldiers she couldn't save, of the faces she could never forget. And now, they wanted her to stand in front of strangers and speak as if those ghosts didn't exist. When morning came, she wore her medals, heavy on her chest, heavier on her heart. The plane waiting for her on the tarmac was unlike anything she'd ever seen. Sleek, white, and quiet. As she climbed the steps, she glanced back one last time at the land she'd fought for. Scarred, frozen, and eternal. She whispered something under her breath in Russian. A farewell, or perhaps a promise. The engines roared, and for the first time in her life, Lyudmila Pavlichenko left the soil of war behind. But as the plane disappeared into the clouds, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She didn't know why she had been chosen, or what awaited her across the ocean. Somewhere deep inside, she felt it. This mission would not be about bullets and blood. It would be about lies, power, and the ghosts that still lived inside her. And in that moment, as the land vanished beneath the clouds, Lyudmila Pavlichenko realized one thing.
The war wasn't over. Not yet.
The sound of the airplane engines faded as the wheels touched American soil. The air smelled different, cleaner, calmer, unreal. For Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the silence felt heavier than any battlefield she had ever walked on. There were no bombs here, no smoke, no echo of dying men. But still her heart raced, not from fear, but from uncertainty. When she stepped down from the plane, flashes blinded her eyes. Cameras, journalists, soldiers, diplomats, all waiting for the woman they called Lady Death. For the first time, Lyudmila wasn't hidden in the shadows. She was standing under bright lights, surrounded by strangers who cheered her name without knowing what it really meant. Reporters shouted questions one after another. How many men did you kill? Was it hard to take a life? What does it feel like to be the world's deadliest woman? She didn't answer. Not because she didn't understand, but because she didn't know how to explain. How could she tell them that every bullet still echoed in her dreams? How could she tell them that the word kill didn't make her proud? It made her quiet. Government officials guided her into cars, from hotels to conference halls, from meetings to speeches. Everywhere she went there were eyes, curious, admiring, and sometimes afraid. The Americans saw her as both hero and myth. A real-life ghost from the front lines, a living weapon from the East. But behind her calm expression something was breaking. The cheers of the crowd reminded her of the screams of the dying. The camera flashes looked like explosions, and the polite smiles of the politicians, they felt colder than the snows of Sevastopol. At one event she was introduced to Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady of the United States. Unlike the others, Eleanor didn't ask about her kills. She asked if Lyudmila slept well at night. For a second, the sniper's mask cracked. She almost smiled. Almost. It was the first time anyone had spoken to her like she was a person, not a legend. They traveled together through several American cities: Chicago, New York, Washington. Everywhere, Lyudmila spoke to crowds of thousands. She told them what she had seen: the destroyed homes, the brave women fighting beside her, the smell of death that never left the air. Her voice was steady, powerful, and full of something the audience couldn't name: truth. One speech became famous. Standing before a crowd of men in Washington, she said, "Gentlemen, I am 25 years old, and I have killed 309 fascist invaders. Don't you think you have been hiding behind my back for too long?" The crowd went silent. The words hit harder than any bullet could. In that moment, Lady Death became not just a soldier, but a force. A reminder that courage had no gender and war had no mercy. But as applause thundered around her, Lyudmila felt nothing. No pride, no peace. Only the familiar weight in her chest. The cheers felt hollow. Because she knew that while she was here, speaking of victory, her comrades were still dying across the sea. Late at night, in her hotel room, she would sit by the window and stare at the city lights. The noise of cars and laughter outside made her feel like she was on another planet. She would take out her small notebook, the same one she used at the front lines, and flip through its worn pages. The ink had faded, but the numbers were still there. Every kill, every date, every memory. Sometimes she thought she could hear their voices, the men she shot, calling her from the dark corners of her mind. She would press her hands to her ears, whispering to herself in Russian, "It's over, it's over." But deep down she knew it wasn't. And then, one night as she prepared for another speech, there was a knock on her door. A soft, hesitant knock, not the kind used by officials or guards. When she opened it, a young journalist stood there, nervous, holding a notebook. "Miss Pavlichenko," he said quietly. "I've been researching your saint." After her visit to America in 1942, Lyudmila Pavlichenko became a symbol of Soviet bravery. But fame couldn't silence the war inside her mind. The crowds that once cheered her name had no idea what she had truly lived through. Behind her calm face, the memories of Sevastopol still burned like fresh wounds. She had seen friends die beside her, cities reduced to dust, and young soldiers fading into the silence of the battlefield. Even after leaving the front lines, she carried the sounds of war inside her. The echo of bullets, the cries of her fallen comrades, and the faces she could never forget. When she returned to the Soviet Union, her role changed. She no longer held a rifle. Instead, she trained the next generation of snipers, But even in peace, she never found peace. Years later, she said in an interview that the hardest part of war wasn't the killing. It was remembering every face that didn't return. Lyudmila lived a quiet life after the war, far away from the spotlight. She wrote her memoirs, attended military ceremonies, and spoke for women who had served during the darkest days of World War II. Yet, till the end of her life in 1974, she remained haunted by her memories. The woman who once stood fearless on the battlefield now fought a different kind of battle, one against her own past. Her story reminds us that behind every number, every medal, and every photograph of victory, there lies a human soul that paid the real price of war. If you found this story meaningful, do like the video and subscribe to the channel for more true stories from the forgotten pages of war. Tell us in the comments, should our next episode uncover the Battle of Stalingrad's hidden snipers or the untold story of the Ghost Division?